Hey guys, welcome to another edition of T Leaves Houston, T.E.A. Leaves Houston, the podcast that's trying to prepare Houston for that day when T.E.A. departs. It is going to happen. And the only question really is whether we as a community are going to be prepared for that departure. Joining me are two of our co-conspirators here, Uyosa Legon, as well as Tori Cofield. Mike is away. I think he's solving the world's problems in some other part of the world. So, Mike, we miss you. Come back soon. We're also joined with a sitting kind of trustee. I'm not sure how to talk about this sometimes, but Sue Dygard, someone I've known for, I don't know, Sue, is it 10 years or more? Maybe, I don't know. It's been a while.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we're trying to be constructive. We're trying to be solution oriented. Mike normally talks as the trustee kind of expert. He's, a longtime trustee at Spring Branch ISD. Tori's been a superintendent, a principal, teacher, student that started school. She's done everything. She's kind of representing that school side and maybe the parent side. And then Uyosa was a part of the student congress at HISD. He's 25 years old. He's talking about and really trying to help us understand what youth are thinking about. And so now, Sue, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you. It's nice to be here. And you know me, I love having these conversations. So
Yes.
thank
Yes. And I love hearing my own voice. So this works out well. Why don't we start, Sue, for those few folks that may not know your experience with HISD and your tenure there, could you just give a quick 1 minute orientation of your interactions with HISD?
Yeah, happy to. So I am one of the elected school board members who have been sidelined by the temporary board of managers. I was elected, well, I was sworn in January of 2018. So I served at the dais for 5.5 years through some of the most tumultuous times of this
Oof.
district.
Wow.
And prior to that, I was a parent advocate. I really started in that space advocating on school finance, and that's become an area that really still I think is very relevant with all with the ESSER dollars that are about to run out in another year.
And I'm going to need you we're going to throw around acronyms. We just need to make sure we explain each one as we come up. So, okay, keep going. Is that it?
I think, and I was a parent of two kids who have now graduated and are one's in college and one is full on adulting.
Well, I'm hopefully going to get there too. I'll be adulting one day.
It's probably helpful to even explain the extra dollars before we even go into things.
Thank you.
Curious.
Yeah. Yeah. So federal ESSER dollars were COVID relief dollars for school systems. And HISD, received a hefty amount of money for COVID learning loss. So to mitigate the time that students weren't in the classroom, making sure they get caught up on literacy, math, college and career readiness. And districts had basically 3 years to spend those dollars, although there's some latitude of encumbering them before those 3 years are up, but as long as they're spent within a prescribed period of time. So the other kind of related conversation is about the fiscal cliff that districts are headed towards as our ESSER dollars, these federal COVID relief learning dollars run out or expire really. And that's really going to align for a lot of districts, including HISD, that had structural deficits even before we had these federal relief dollars. And I think I have not seen enough conversation yet about the impact or lack thereof of districts, whether HISD specifically or nationally in general, on the impact of those dollars, because we're always hearing, oh, we need more money, we need more money. One of the criticisms about the board of managers is, well, okay, you've put these other people in place, but unless there are additional dollars coming from the state, it's unlikely to change anything. And I think that there's a bigger conversation that is needing to be had about how we spend money and to what outcome.
Yeah.
Before we can honestly say that money matters, but how the money's spent matters equally.
Yeah. That conversation is long overdue. Let's do a little bit of background, because just for folks that may not know Sue and know kind of the 5 years that she was in it during the low point, in my view, of HISD. I hesitate to go back in time. It was a mess. Let's just say, folks listening that don't know about it, it was a hot mess, a public hot mess, national news hot mess kind of stuff. But since that time, though, we still have had FBI raids of senior officials within HISD. That just happened, was it 2-3 years ago, Sue?
2020.
Yeah, 2 years ago. So like, this issue about what's going on in leadership at the board is not over. And again, one of the things we want to help people, those 10 people who might be listening, 3 of which are my family members, hi mom, is to understand what it's like to be a board member, and why would anyone choose to put themselves in that space. Maybe we start there.
Why would somebody choose to put themselves in this space? I think different people are motivated for different reasons. So speaking for myself, it was, I had knowledge and experience as an education advocate, and built up relationships, and was really led by a sense of responsibility to put that to greater use, and believed when I ran for office that in that moment in time, that the school board was a place that I may be able to impact change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's keep questions going around. Just put your finger up if you have a question for Sue, and so I'll keep going. Or did I see a hand? Okay, I'll keep going. So Sue, do you give, when I've been involved with school districts for a while, and what I have seen is actually there are 3 types of people that run for school board. There are those who have a financial self-interest, so they have some tie to the finances of the school district. Again, we're talking about a $2 billion budget that's fundamentally controlled by 9 people. So huge amount of leverage that each board member has. So some people seem like they run because they see an opportunity, maybe for a grift, or for helping out a friend, whatever it may be, right? And there's tons of examples of that. That's number one. Second group, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, Tori. Second group are people who see this as a stepping stone into politics, right? So this is the first opportunity to get their name out there, to build a base of support. And so those folks are less interested really in how this district functions, and more interested in can they get a base of support, so people who are passionate about them individually, so when they run for Congress or legislature or whatever they want to do. So that's the second group. And then the third group, maybe, hopefully you were in that group, Sue. I don't see in the first 2, but are people who are like doing this out of responsibility, or they're angry. Maybe they're angry about what's happening to kids. But those folks seem to have the least chance of winning, because finances are actually all at play here. So what do you think of that?
Oh, there's a lot baked into all of that, and I think you're right about the 3 different motivating factors. I think when I look back, when I first ran, I think I was naive to that first one, and I think there's this presumption that there is nefarious stuff going on in any large organization. I don't think it became completely apparent until the FBI walked in the door, that wasn't just a, oh, we think this might exist. No, it really, we now have evidence that it did exist. I would talk about, the friends and family plan, right, with jobs and contracts. And I actually think that that's part of what some people are upset about with this transfer of power, right, is
the risk that more of that is happening, politics or financial
that
control.
That people who had control and power and contracts before don't have it anymore. And that maybe new people will have it, or maybe, that the act will finally get cleaned up and the right systems will get put in place, even though me and my colleagues worked incredibly hard over these 5 years to take a nearly non-existent audit function and rebuild it. It wasn't quite to where I wanted it to be by the time I was off. I don't know if I'm really off the board. I'm still an elected board member, but I'm no longer on the audit committee. I no longer have any authority, but by June 1st, I still hadn't gotten it to where me and some of my colleagues wanted it to be. But I do think that that's a real thing that exists. The stepping stone, we've seen evidence of that, of people and it's not just here in HISD.
No.
I think that's a lot of places. And I think that there are even organizations that train people up starting in school board. And, for me personally, I have been recruited to run for the state legislature a couple of times and always said no, because I didn't feel like that was really where I was going to make the impact on education that I wanted to make. But the sense of responsibility part, as I shared earlier, I mean, that was the motivating factor for me in doing it. And it was really grounded in what we've been doing historically isn't working for kids. And how can we have a 21st century system for a 21st century society and economy that is equitable for all kids and takes into consideration the fact that all kids aren't starting in the same place and they're not widgets. And how do you take a one size fits all system and rebuild it to meet the needs of all kids?
Right. You also.
For folks who aren't aware and kind of only see or hear about a school board in the news or when something goes haywire, tell me what that kind of time responsibility that's put on you all, right? So from the very beginning, when you're elected, let's, push forward through all the campaign. You're elected, you're sworn in. What's the amount of time that you all normally dedicate to the work? What type of trainings are held by the district, and what types of trainings are outside the district that a lot of folks engage in? And then I definitely have a follow-up question as far as later.
I think the trainings before someone even runs for office or is elected, I think is a very weak spot. I am a huge fan of student outcome focused governance, where you are leading from a place of what outcomes do you want for kids. Literacy, numeracy, college and career readiness, and there are different ways of measuring that. Social emotional skills, critical thinking skills, I think those are a little more difficult to measure, but not impossible. We just haven't come up with a way of doing that yet. And there are some trainings that prospective board members can take that are available to them through different organizations, so they can understand really what the role of a board member is and isn't. I think a lot of people conflate school board governance and this role with other kinds of government structures, and we don't run the school system like city council runs the city. We govern, and it's very different. And having served on nonprofit boards, I'd say it is more akin to those than it is to the legislature or city council or Congress. And so the question becomes, how do you help future candidates understand it? But you also have to help the electorate understand it.
Bingo.
Because candidates, even if they understand what their role is, if voters don't understand what their role is, they're going to like, well, if you're not going to promise me that you're going to do blah, 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 then I'm not going to vote for you. But a lot of times candidates will therefore, either through their own lack of understanding or through just the necessity of trying to win, will say, yeah, I'll do that. But it's not the role of a board member legally. And they have no power to do it. And then the electorate gets mad that they don't accomplish it.
Sure. Sure.
And it's just this vicious cycle of that.
Furiosa.
So thinking about, your time on the board, in how different do you imagine it may be for the board of managers? From my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, most, if not all, of the board of managers haven't necessarily served on any school board previously, and they were not elected, so they don't necessarily have some of the same levels of accountability to community members. So I'm wondering the kind of initiation process, if that will be right, the process of you getting into the office, learning from the staff and whatnot. How different do you feel like it is for the board of managers, if you can just imagine in any way?
Yeah. I think there are pros and cons to their situation right now. I think the deficit that they're operating from is, if you run for office, in order to be a viable candidate, there is some level of understanding of the issues in the system that you should already have. Not all candidates actually do. But I think they learn some of them through the campaign process. And you're certainly community building and building relationships and understanding of community interest and need through that campaign process, if you hadn't already done it through some other role or relationship with your community prior to your campaign. And so I think that that's a deficit that is inherent in a board of managers. They're going to have to work really hard to get themselves up to speed on that. The benefit that they have is they're protected a little bit from feeling like they need to make decisions to win in their next election, which can be and often is something that influences,
Right.
by the nature of our system, that influences an elected official in any position. And so I think that the idea behind the board of managers is partially to allow the organization to move forward without that kind of influence. But I think the challenge they're going to have is if they don't build relationships with the community is just going to try everything they can to jump in front of them. And as Matt's already lifted up, what changes them when it converts back to an elected board? It's just the pendulum.
Snapback.
Yep.
Snapback is the term that we're throwing around now. Yep.
Okay. Yeah.
So thinking, and speaking of influence, right? A lot of folks feel like they don't have it on HISD right now, particularly anyone that you probably talk to in the city, or anyone who's gone to any of Mike Miles's so-called community engagement meetings. I'm wondering, broadly and specifically, if you can give me some thoughts on how you, I don't know if you've attended any, how you have felt those community engagement meetings have gone in the kind of broad swath, and if you feel like that these community engagement meetings are actually being any bit helpful, as far as having community members who attend feel a lot more informed and a lot more peaceful, and having the district actually leave with information that they actually would act on.
Oh, so first of all, I have not attended any of those. I decided to escape the heat and take a long overdue break for a few weeks, which was an intentional decision on my part. I think communities feeling heard is critical. I don't know that the breadth and depth of community engagement and community voice was actually being heard even when we had an elected board.
Agreed.
I think that was a flaw that our organization is a flaw that our organization has always had. As a parent, I felt that a lot of times the information that came from the administration, decisions were already made, and it was a PR campaign. It wasn't about authentic engagement. It wasn't about really understanding what families want for their children's education at its core. That question has never, ever been asked. And I feel like it gets dominated by small, loud groups, and it makes parents and caregivers and educators who might have a more nuanced view harder to hear them, especially if they're not organized to come to a large meeting. And so it becomes incumbent on the organization now, in the moment we're in, not in the past, we can't dial back the clock, to set a new standard and practice for community engagement. That is, who are we not hearing from? Right?
That's why I've been quiet. I mean, I thank you for saying that, first of all. Like, that was huge, especially coming from you. But in that you were sitting in that seat and you realized that was a deficit that we had. And so for me, I'm a little different than these guys are big researchers. I live vicariously through Matt. So when I need to know something, I just call him. A lot of times I stay away from a lot of because I'm always in the schools. I'm working with kids every day. I'm on the front line. I don't have time to sit and watch all of this, and because I'm, checking teachers' lesson plans and doing all those things. And so my frustration is that I don't feel like we were ever heard. So now, while I'm upset because it was kind of promised to us that we would be heard and that this would be done differently. I'm not surprised that they didn't make good on the promise. And I don't feel like, all the way back to when Paula was on the school board, that we were heard. And she's a friend of mine who I respect tremendously. And I know some things that she tried to get done while she was on the board, and I know her well enough to know that, just like I feel the same way about you, Sue, because of your relationship with Matt. Like, I know him, and he wouldn't spend his time on people that are not like he is. You know what I mean? So for that reason, I trust that I trust your view just like I would Paula's, because I know who she is in the core of who she is. I don't care what anybody says. I know what she believes. I know what she wanted for kids or what she wants for people. But I still feel like, we can, the last young man that was in office, the superintendent, he did all of these. He went around every community and he listened. And I don't remember seeing anything happen after, but he did do it. He went down and he took all the heavy hits and he opened himself up. And so I'm almost like, almost don't blame Miles for his attitude, because what are you going to do with it? Are you just doing it because you want us to be appeased? Or are you planning on taking what you hear from us and actually going back and doing something with it? I haven't seen that happen. I haven't seen that happen when we had an appointed board. So my question or comment, or what I'd like to hear you comment on is, I know for a fact that the schools that I specifically worked with and the schools that I was specifically concerned with were the schools that are being focused, those NES schools now, have been a focus of mine for 30 years. And I feel like the board, when you were on the board back when Paula was on, I don't think anybody addressed those schools as a board holistically. Everybody, it felt like, and again, I'm just going with the little bit I heard in the news and the kind of little bit I heard from my husband or Matt, like it felt like the board was more concerned with their area and the area they represented, and not really looking at HISD as a whole and saying, look, if these schools are not doing well, we're not doing well. And how could every board member, and being a board member myself now, currently I sit on a couple of boards, and understanding the dynamic of the board, I've said to the board that I'm on, every one of us is responsible for every kid in this school district. So if we're letting a superintendent sit in a seat that's not doing a good job, that's our responsibility. We are failing kids. So if I live in the area that's zone to that covers the Lamar High School feeder pattern, I am still responsible for those kids at Yates
Oh yeah.
all day, every day. But that is not what we felt. And and not only did we feel it, we didn't see in the decisions that HISD was making for kids did not, benefit those kids in those schools. I mean, clearly it went for years. So while I'm not a big fan of Mike Miles and what he's doing, I'm almost like, did it take this for us to get some attention to the schools that have been needing attention historically since I was in high school?
Decades.
And we're not going to talk about how old I am.
I think it is. I think there's a lot of complexities in here. I think first of all, and I've been sitting here writing notes about what you're asking. You're spot on about the challenge of single member districts. I don't know, I've had some people ask me, should we be all at large instead of single member? Should it be a hybrid of both? I would want to have a deep analysis by political scientists that really look at voting histories and, does it actually change things for the better or not? Before I weigh in on an opinion on that. But when I was board chair and I tried to we had 4 new board members out of 9. And I wanted to break out of the single member district mindset, because it is a mindset. It is a cultural phenomenon of single member elected structure. And I was always very clear, I don't represent District 5. District 5 schools aren't my schools and other district schools, other trustee schools. They are all my schools. They are all my kids, and all families are my constituents. That District 5 was my voters.
Yeah.
And because there's a difference. And I had this game that we started to play that anytime any board member said my district or your district that used that language, we put a poker chip in a cup. And if you review tapes from those first couple of months of 2020, that's what we were doing to really bring some mindfulness to our language. Because if we could change our language, we could start seeing this district much more holistically.
Sue, I don't want to interrupt you. I just want to kind of keep this conversation bouncing around a little bit more, but finish your thought and then
but I wanted to talk about historically underperforming, underserved communities. Yeah. And HISD has had many iterations of resources and supports, and whether we call them reform or whatever words we're using that haven't been co-opted in a box at this point. We had Apollo, we had Achieve 180, I'm already forgetting what Millard House called them. We now have NES, right? There's always been something. We have been putting resources into our low performing campuses. Wheatley High School is one of the highest funded per student capita schools in the entire district. They receive about 3 times per student than a student in Bel Air High School. Part of the challenge is economies of scale, but we have been putting resources in schools. The challenge has been, are we putting resources into systemic change or into getting kids to pass tests? Are we doing it to improve educational outcomes for students, or to avoid sanctions under HB 1842 on school ratings? I struggle personally with school ratings. And however, it's the system we're in. Our board has approved, under Millard House, we approved every single budgetary request that he made. Every one of them. Every resource he wanted for underperforming campuses. And we did the same thing with Granita Latham before that. We approved everything the superintendent asked for. It is up to the board to decide the goals and the constraints. It is up to the superintendent to decide the strategy for achieving those things. It is up to the board to monitor the progress. If there's one thing that I would go back in time and fight harder for, it would have been, we had under our leadership over the last 3 years, we passed these in the fall of 2020. We have 5 constraints. Most of them were inputs. They were communication, they were pre-K, wraparound services. There were 2 more that I can't recall in this moment. I would have had a constraint that said the superintendent shall not allow the percentage of or the number of D and F campuses to stay the same or increase. And I would have had one that said the superintendent shall not allow the number of A and B campuses to stay the same or decrease, because those would have driven system level change.
I don't have any idea why TEA didn't do that. Like that to me, that should have been required.
TEA couldn't do that because we were in a lawsuit with them.
I'm not talking about doing a law. I'm talking about in 1988.
Well,
I'm talking about
that's
like
going back in time.
This is not just this is not.
Yeah. And that's essentially what House Bill 1842 was trying to drive.
So
Right.
we also, I want to stay on this because there's a lot here. We also, is this related to this conversation?
I no, it's a little different. So please do.
Can you hold that thought then?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I think what Tori's getting at, and again, I don't want to spend too much time on the past here, but the past is forming present and potentially giving us a sense of what's likely to happen in the future. And so what she's talking about is the relative importance of improving low performing students to the relative importance of keeping high performing students and making them higher. And it seems like the weight is on that latter side. And it seems like it's always been the case. And it's not, I mean, again, I don't put this at the feet of the board. I also really talk about this in the sense of a community, that the community, the only conversations we really have about schools are the schools that are, quote unquote, good schools. We don't really talk about the Yateses of the world in any consistent ongoing conversation. We don't talk about the data about just how terrible these kids are performing. Right. And not just Yates. Let's talk about the feeder pattern leading up to Yates. Right. That's actually the district that I was campaigning for. And we're talking about 1 in 10 kids reading on grade level in 3rd grade. And we don't even talk about that. And that's the question I keep wondering, what is happening? Why is that not the number one red flag that just causes everybody's stomach to churn any conversation that's happening at the board level?
So at the board level, I would say we did not in the way that I think could have been optimal. I think from a low performance, like from a campus specific standpoint, if we had constraints that the board was monitoring on our school ratings, that would have driven system level change. We did regularly monitor the progress of our students. Our goals, which were 3rd grade literacy, 3rd grade numeracy, college and career readiness, and special education, we monitored those 4 times a year. Or we monitored them 3 times a year. The 4th time was really more with our taper report. And that's a conversation for another day about the effectiveness of that process and the alignment to actually driving system level change. But our report would disaggregate our, gosh, I wish I could remember what they were before they were NAS, what they were called, but was monitoring that group of chronically low performing schools. Like we would have separate slides. We weren't looking at specific schools within that. But we looked
within the feeder pattern, you mean?
We were not, we don't get, the board doesn't get down to the granular level of what is happening on the campus.
Gotcha.
Right. That is not the board's role. The board is to hold the superintendent accountable to the goal at the district level. Now we could have and this is, I get that it's replaying the tape. And the appointed board could choose to do this, of not have the goal be in the aggregate, but they could make a goal for literacy that is about a specific group of students.
Yeah.
They could make the goal around literacy be African
Black
American
boys.
male third graders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they could zero in on that as a high leverage, high impact focus that would drive change for students, not just at our lowest performing campuses where struggling students are concentrated, but would also drive that change for the struggling populations of students that exist even in our A and B campuses.
That's right. That are still struggling. Thank you. Uyoso.
In the spirit of, this podcast being named T.E.A. Leaves, and understanding that we're having a conversation about what could we be after T.E.A. leaves Houston ISD. And because, to out myself, I tend to never talk about academic performance. I tend to not necessarily focus on that as one of the most important things for broader society. But I do want to ask, if we're coming back, if we potentially come back to the same type of single member district structure, same type of elected governance structure, potentially after T.E.A. leaves, is that any better? No matter, because thinking from a process wise of making decisions and being accountable to community members, is that any better? And is that going to be a really good situation? And should we look into what other districts across the country, headed by Vote 16 USA, have been doing in trying to lower the voting age to 16? Because from my perspective and the things that I was saying, and people are really uncomfortable when I say that, technically, school board elected officials are not accountable to kids. They're accountable to their voters. Kids don't vote for school board officials. So yes, it's a hot question.
That's a great question.
Their parents don't vote for school board members either.
Yeah, right.
Right. I mean, there is a bigger issue there than just lowering the voting age. And T.E.A. leaves. I think it's, what does the board of managers do over these 5 years to change the conversation with the community of how they engage with the community, what that participation looks like, what that communication looks like, what the ownership looks like by students, their families, and educators. What does that look like to have ownership, true ownership? How is it done in a way that isn't just about, and I'm going to probably regret my choice of words, but people who want to co-opt power for self-interest through those first two reasons that Matt lifted up as motivators for people running for office. How do we truly transfer ownership to families?
Although I want to put a pin in that idea, because I'd like you to keep coming back to that and asking other folks about that question, because if we want student ownership and they are not able to even have a comment, we actually had students on the show, what was it, last week, and one just graduated. She knew nothing about, or I'm sorry, he knew nothing about what was going on, very small amount about what was going on within HISD. Like he's got no reason to. He's just gonna take whatever they give him. If he had a vote, there's a chance that he might be much more active, even to the point of, I don't know why we wouldn't have a student representative on the board or multiple student representatives on the board. So not a conversation for today, but we can put a pin in that, and come back to it in the future. Other questions for Sue? Or Sue, did you have a comment?
I've got another comment, though, to Uyosa's question, is what does meaningful student engagement look like, right? Like, so this board of managers should be because this is what was told to us, even though, so HISD's elected board, we created our current goals and constraints in the fall of 2020. They were 5-year goals. They are set to expire this year. Why 2023 when they were set in 2020 and their 5-year goals, the math doesn't work? Well, it's because our baseline data was 2019. And what we were told in those community meetings by T.E.A. this spring is that one of the things that this board of managers will be doing is setting goals and constraints for the district for the next 5 years. And our elected board had already started in that process so that we would have this seamless transition to the next generation when these expire. So what we should be able to expect from the board of managers is really meaningful community engagement in the months ahead. That is not just the handful, and I've seen, the post of there's like 8 meetings, maybe 10 coming up. I don't know really the logic behind the geography of it. And I think that if it's only come one, come all meetings like those, that it's a flawed structure.
Absolutely.
I think there's room for that, but I think you also have to go into really into community, go to those community meetings that are already being held by civic clubs, PTO meetings. There are some schools where families will come to a meeting in their cafeteria that their principal invites them to, but they're not going to come across town or even a couple schools away.
Nope.
They're going to be afraid to speak up. So what does that really deep, broad engagement look like? So there is real community ownership by the incredible diversity of families and students served, that are then represented in anywhere from 1 to 5 goals that this board of managers will create, and the 1 to 5 guardrails, or they'll call them constraints, that they will create. How is this board of managers going to be advised in that process? To my knowledge, they don't have a governance coach. They've all gone to a 2-day training, but there is a research study that shows that there are greater gains that are made for kids when a board employs the ongoing support of a governance coach.
Well, just to clarify, they do have a coach.
My understanding is that they don't.
Well, it's not AJ, but they do have a coach. So, Uyosa, you want to follow up, clarify?
Yeah, just clarifying question, because I'm actually zooming out and thinking about the entire nation. Is HISD one of the largest districts in a metropolitan city that doesn't have a kind of a city school district attached? For example, like I'm thinking about Chicago, for example, where I believe the city actually has and the mayor has some sort of decision-making power and whatnot. Is Houston one of the only big ones?
I don't have an answer to that question. And, and I think that also, getting at governance structures, there's still politics involved in that.
Yeah, always.
Right. And I don't want
to transfer ownership up in a political structure. I'd rather transfer ownership down to families.
Right. I'm not an advocate of doing that. I think, I'm bringing it up because I'm concerned that if this is the last one, what do we have to do to change the way that we make decisions and be accountable to one another? So I'm just trying to
have a solution to that.
Oh, and I don't know, Matt, if we got go ahead.
If you have a solution, hey, look, we're about solutions. We just can't find any.
That was my question. That was going to be my question. What do you think we should do? I mean, what would you advise?
So there is a misunderstood policy on the books here in Texas called Senate Bill 1882 that was passed in the spring of, I think it was 2017. I think it was passed. And, part of the challenge with it is it does give a district the ability to partner with a charter school. And that freaks a lot of people out. But at its core, first of all, it doesn't have to be a partnership with a charter school. It could also be a existing or a newly formed nonprofit. It can be a institution of higher education. It can also be another governmental entity. For example, a Houston, like a school district in Harris County might choose to partner with the Harris County Department of Education on pre-K, right? You know, and it generates additional resources for HISD. It is approximately $1,500 per student. And what it allows is for a district to, there is a performance contract between the district and that contracted entity with performance metrics around student outcomes, student achievement, around financial, and also around operational. But they have autonomy to determine how to accomplish the what. And the local district, you know, in our case, you know, Houston ISD would determine the what, and then they get to determine the how. They're given autonomy over staffing, budgeting, and programming. And one of the things that I tried to do a year ago was make some changes to the local policy, which is ELA local, that governs which HISD already had in the books that we passed in 2018, that would govern how we might do those partnerships. And it would give ownership to families to say, hey, I want my school, you know, 60% of the families in that campus said they wanted a partner. They could petition for a partner for that campus. They also would have given them veto power, that if the district tried to partner them with an entity that they didn't want as a partner, that they could veto that. It would have also given families, you know, we have a lot of underutilized facilities. We have a lot of HISD students that are in private school, homeschool, and charter school.
Yes.
It would have given the opportunity in one of the growing populations of homeschool families are African-American inner city families.
Yep.
Because the traditional system is not working for their children. And I think there's an erroneous presumption that it is all people are homeschooling because of religious reasons, and that's no longer the case. I don't know that it was always the case.
So 1882 gives it, like you said earlier, it pushes autonomy or authority into the community rather than centralizing it. Right. It can.
With these proposed changes that I brought forward for ELA local, it would have allowed, let's say there were 50 homeschool families that, or let's say there were 5 homeschool families, but new other families that they wanted to bring in to the fold. The biggest impediment to new school design is facilities and money. So you could form a nonprofit. We give you space. We're giving you resources to pay for that adult in the room. That is, whether we call them teacher or coach or whatever you want to frame it as, you know, and you could have then used those resources to access other things on that campus that the traditional school had, through your dollars, and a teacher who had an idea. You know, Tori, if you wanted to start a program, a micro school, you would be able to, as long as you had a certain percentage of families for whatever your target enrollment was going to be, you could have created that within HISD. It would have attracted families back to our district. It would have been incubators for innovation.
So I remember talking about this some years ago, and right now, actually an hour ago, it stopped. There was a group of parents that I gathered that are meeting at my church right now for some of the same reasons that you and I talked about. That's not a spiritual thing, that's part of it, but it's principally they're just concerned that their kids are not going to get a fair shake. But what I'd like to do is to use this as an example of ideas that are non-standard, right? They're risk. There's a level of risk associated with the institution of HISD. If this really takes off, then that would mean that there'd be lots of kids that are no longer kind of owned by HISD, and that causes a lot of people fear, because really what we're coming down to is a thing about power, and that institutions don't want to lose power. So that's an idea, though, that I would love to hear more about. We're running out of time today, so maybe we can just hold that thought, and then we can
Let's have
talk
that
more.
let's come back and have
Yeah,
that
we can talk
conversation.
about.
Would
Yep.
love to talk more about that.
Yep. We do need to start bringing this to closure. So we've heard some good ideas around, advocate or bringing more ownership to community members and students. This idea that Sue brought up about the House Bill 1882 of really kind of decentralizing some of HISD. Any other ideas or any other thoughts that you would hope would get some elevation in this current kind of TEA leadership?
I want them to ask families what they want for their kids' education. I want them to ask students what they want from their education. I want this, 5 years is a long time in a children's education.
Oh man.
And the world is going to be really, really different. We've heard the new superintendent talk about 2035. The world's already going to look different in 5 years.
Oh yeah.
And I think we are missing the boat, and that this will inherently become a failed experiment if this is just more one size fits all traditional system, and we're not redefining. Yosa, you made a comment earlier about not really, kind of wanting to stay away from this conversation on student achievement. And I think what we really need to be doing is talking about what students need to know and need to be able to do by the time they're 18 years old for this rapidly changing world that they're going to enter into. And it's more complex than just job skills or college readiness.
Absolutely.
And that this board of managers is got to have that conversation with the community. I think the superintendent has some triage that he has to do in these early months and in this first school year on very high need campuses where you have kids in middle school and high school that are at best, in some cases reading on an elementary school level. Like,
very
really
common.
Has to double down and personalize learning. I think the conversation on these team centers is incredibly complex. But if there is going to be some personalized learning that is going to happen for students at all levels of achievement to make sure that they are caught up while other kids who are already moving at a faster pace continue to have their needs met in those campuses. I don't think it's wrong to find a solution for that.
Yeah.
And then I hope that the conversation at our district level with this new leadership team of 10 moves on to what does an innovative system of 21st century teaching and learning with teacher pipeline shortages that are not going to change with the next group of kids coming out of college. What does this all need to look like? And how can they use this opportunity to really be a leader in transforming that of parent and guardian ownership of the system, and really what students need to know and know what to do.
I would encourage you, if you haven't listened to the interview last week with what was his name, Angel Garcia, really sharp young man, and was blistering in his critique of how out of touch leadership from all levels of schools were to the realities of life as a young student. And one comment that's just kind of keeps ringing in my ears, he said, if he wasn't going to college, he wouldn't know what he would do. He's completely unprepared to enter into adult life at 18. And yet the majority of kids that come through HISD, that is exactly what we're asking them to do, and they're not ready. And that should be a real shameful, reflection on our process.
Matt, the only reason, in my perspective, the kids who are ready are because there was another adult ancillary to the school system that
Yeah.
helped them be ready.
That's right.
And,
That's right.
and there are some significant life skills, lifelong learning skills that even when I was a student in you know, those many years ago, I mean, I still remember sitting in class as a 16-year-old learning about the Civil War before state mandated standardized tests, where I was going to just have to regurgitate dates and places on a multiple choice test, and sitting there as a kid in Northern Illinois with mittens and a coat in my cold classroom because our building was old, not caring about an old building, caring about what I was learning and not learning, and desperately wanting to have a conversation on what the Civil War meant and not just regurgitating facts.
Sure.
And we are missing, we were missing it then, we're still missing it now. I don't see enough conversation in trying to change that. And so I'm grateful that you're at least having these conversations. And I think there are more than 10 people that are actually listening.
Well, let's hope so.
And hopefully
One or two of them are my family members. So again, hello, Mom. Listen, let's do this. Let's go ahead and pause this, and we'll come back to it. But Sue, want to just thank you for stepping into the fray, and staying with it in the darkest times of HISD's existence, at least as long as I've been in Houston 25 years. So thank you for that. And hope you get a chance to rest up a little bit, because we need your help ongoing. We've got to get this community ready for TEA's departure. And some of what you talked about, the lack of understanding about the difference between governance, school governance, and a political governance structure that we kind of know too well and are disgusted by. There's a huge difference. Most people don't understand that. The ability and willingness of encouraging folks to run for office that have that third mindset. They're here because they feel a responsibility, and are willing to put themselves in the fray, and to outcompete those who might have some financial interest or some other ties for personal gain. So there's lots of things around this. And then I'll end with the last one. For me, at least, the data that talks about young people reading, particularly Black boys, it's so horrific that if that data was shared constantly, I can't imagine that people wouldn't just be horrified, right? It makes me angry to hear that's the data, and that data has stayed flat for, as Tori said, for probably 20, 30 years. So I'm hopeful that TEA actually might be able to pull the strings on this thing and get some things moving. But I also am worried that if they do, it will snap back into what we've had in the past. And so again, that's the point of this podcast. So on behalf of Tori and Uyosa and Mike Fallick, who again has joined us, Sue, thanks for being here today. And we wish you the best. Hopefully you'll be willing to come back at some point.
I am always happy to have these conversations anytime.
Great. And I'm always happy to hear my own voice. So with that, we'll close it out. And thanks, y'all.
All right. Thank you.
All right.